Welcome to OkState Daily. Casey Porter here. I've been smiling all day long. Poor Sooners. How about that game last night, Coach?
Yeah, incredible. And I want to start off. I'm a little embarrassed because I don't think I did justice to one of your questions on the last podcast of why you don't have as much animosity towards OU baseball as you do maybe other sports. And there's two different kinds of OU fans. And I say this with all sincerity because I've got some dear family members of mine that are OU fans. But there's two different kinds of OU fans. There's OU fans,
yes,
and then there's OU football fans.
Yes, correct.
Okay. And my family members, I attribute this because I've always been able to have a cordial conversation. They dislike OSU as much as I dislike OU. But, when they lived in rural Okfuskee County, if you know where that's at.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And when they retired, they moved to Norman just so that they could attend every OU event that they possibly could. Didn't matter if it was football, basketball, softball, gymnastics. They're an OU football fan. That is they're an OU fan.
Correct.
That is vastly different than an OU football fan. And I kind of attribute that, you watch the movie Dumb and Dumber, the most annoying noise made in the world. There's not much more annoying than an OU football fan. I mean, literally an OU football fan could fall into a tub of feathers and figure out how to make noise and be obnoxious. So anyway, to better answer your question.
And by the way, the OU football fan has no idea there was a game played last night.
No idea. And I'm sure some of those are now huge softball fans and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, that's the difference in that if you go to an OU baseball game, you can still have a cordial conversation with an OU fan, but forget going to an OU football game.
Because they're OU fans and not OU football fans. That's how you differ. Now, that makes sense, Coach. That is an absolutely great way to separate the two. So I deal with OU fans when I go to baseball games. I deal with OU football fans when we're talking about the football games, right? That's a great way to put it.
One of them's enjoyable and one of them's not. So that's
couldn't agree more. Could not agree more. Hey, how about the game last night? You hit on this a lot on our last podcast. The Oklahoma boys. I mean, you're talking about looking at all the guys last night, Colin Ritchie and Jackson Kroll. We've mentioned Jackson Kroll needs more at bats. This dude is just a table setter. He's a producer. And then Avery Ortiz and of course Carson Benj and then Gabe Davis and Drew Blake and all these guys. 10 for 17 last night with a double and a home run. Don't you think it meant something to them? I know it meant a lot to everybody. Tyler Wulfert was the player of the game. It meant a lot to everybody, but it means a lot to those Oklahoma boys.
Absolutely. And that's, like you said, going back to what we've talked about previously of why that's so important to, not just with your coaching staff, but with also your roster of having those guys in your program because they know what these type of games mean to the program in general. It's not just, playing OSU or playing OU in a midweek game, but you're talking about playing a top 20 RPI team in a midweek game. And so, having those Oklahoma kids on your roster and then seeing them and Colin Ritchie's first swing in a Bedlam game's a home run. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that watching those guys produce in the manner that they did last night.
Can you make any more of it other than just it's one non-conference midweek game? Can you make any more of that? I mean, is it a bigger deal than that?
Yeah, I think so. Like I said, you're talking about playing a top 20 RPI team when you played OU last night. And so, and that speaks volumes to the way those guys were able to produce last night and the second time that the lineup has been consistent. We talked about last podcast that I really thought that you were going to see the mental makeup of this team going into the OU game and exciting going into that and seeing what that's going to be and it being, more similar to what you're going to see during conference play. And, watching those guys go out, whether it's from the first at bat to the last at bat and attacking the baseball that's in the zone and not swinging and missing. And, there must have been a really nice conversation on Monday between the weekend series of Mercer and the OU game. Cause it just seemed like the team had a different approach mentally to the game and was more locked in. Didn't see a lot of swings and misses outside the zone, and when the ball was in the zone, they attacked it. So, I think you can attribute that to the things that we've talked about in that, being second time this lineup last night against OU was the same lineup as the last game against Mercer. And so guys getting in a more comfortable role, in a more natural lineup position that's more accustomed to what they do. I think you saw that last night, and combine that with the mental approach offensively and defensively, I think shows what this team is capable of doing.
Aiden Miola, a guy who has a hit in every game this year other than one. He always comes up clutch. He gets an infield base hit. Jackson Kroll hits the ball up the middle. Colin Ritchie hits the ball up the middle. Carson Benj, maybe the best offensive, defensive two-way player in the country, constantly hitting the ball the other way. Tyler Wulfert, hey, he hit the big home run, but he's thinking gap to gap, Coach. He's trying to use the big part of the field. Because of that, because you did that, you had 5 strikeouts, only 4 walks, and how many times have we talked about when the strikeouts and walks for this team are just somewhat close, this is a team that can beat all the good teams in the United States.
Absolutely. I mean, going back to RPI, OSU's 2-1 against top 20 RPI teams. You know, they beat Arkansas, who's RPI number 1 right now, lost to Oregon State, who's a top 10 RPI. OU, I think, sitting at 16 that they beat last night.
I guess they lost to Oregon State, but that Sunday game, man, that's a hard one for me to even acknowledge.
But, you know, and then going into this weekend against UCF, they're a top 10 RPI team. So it's really good to see those guys, and we've talked about it, you know, and it's hard to imagine that you're almost already a third of the way through the season, you know, but it seems in typical Josh Holiday fashion is play with the lineup a little bit. And when you get starting conference weekend, that lineup's going to be set. And I think that's what you're seeing right now. And you know, talking about Miola, you know, one of the things that you notice right off the bat is the things that we've talked about him and just being, you know, a gritty ball player that's just going to get the job done and being okay with, you know, fisting one back to the pitcher with 2 strikes as opposed to striking out. And that's exactly what he did. And, you know, he hits that knobber to the third base side that probably didn't go as far as a bunt would go, and it's a single, you know. And
was happy as hell just to get on base.
That's exactly right. And you know, and when he gets to second base later that inning, you know, he's clapping and rooting on the guy at the plate, and I mean, just a guy that you want to be a teammate, you know, a great teammate and a great baseball player and fun to watch, and you know, the things that we've talked about as far as just putting the ball in play and giving the opponent an opportunity to make an error, and you saw some of that also.
Sure
and
did.
So it's not just the 4 walks, but it's the 4 hit by pitches, and then it's the catcher's interference. I mean, you literally got 9 free bases without having to swing the bat. And so very, very good to see those things come to fruition, of the things that, you know, we've talked a lot about the negative things of OSU baseball the last week or so, and the things that kind of drive you crazy. And it seems like those things kind of resolved themselves last night, and hopefully moving forward.
Sure did. And I really like the way that Rob used his bullpen. Hey, Dominic Reed, looking at his he has a starter's mix. This is a guy that really should be in a college starting rotation. When you look at the slider, you look at the changeup that turns right, he can tumble his changeup. He has a good high-riding four-seam, and then also more of a breaking ball that has more downward depth to it, so he can kind of shape it a little bit differently. That guy, I'm telling you, inserting him, he started on the IL in the season, inserting him, if you can get him, Drew Blake, Brennan Phillips, and add them to Tommy Molsky, who for the first 2 innings last night, Tommy Molsky was badass. And you add them to Gabe Davis. And then also you have Carson Benj. I mean, that's a pretty legit bullpen, the way that shapes up. Again, Drew Blake, Brennan Phillips, your 2 lefties that come out of the pen and throw strikes filled up. Drew Blake can miss barrels with the velo. Brennan Phillips has that big sweeper. And then Dominic Reed with a starters mix, and Gabe Davis, 2 guys that could give you 4 or 5 innings if you needed. That's a really good college bullpen. Yeah,
absolutely. And, you know, even talking about Bogut's, you know,
yes.
It seems like his kryptonite right now is how long is it going to take him to get going, you know, but when he gets going, that ball's moving up and down. It's moving left to right. There's never a ball that's flat on the plane, and he's living around the knees. And, you know, in that second inning last night, he threw really well and looked really good. And then, like you're talking about how Coach Walton mixed that up, how different of a look was that for Molsky to follow up Bogut's.
Yeah.
I mean, you got Bogut's who's more methodical and kind of flips it up there, and the ball's moving all over the place. And then you bring in a Molsky who's throwing mid-90s and just painting corners and just pumping it by people. You know,
a 3/4 slot.
Yeah, and throwing an 88, 89 mile an hour slider, you know. And so I thought the same thing last night watching the game was that, you know, how difficult that was. I mean, those OU batters were more confused than a chameleon in a Skittles bag, when Molsky come in. It was, the timing was off, and he just gets the ball. He's one of those guys that it's almost like before the ball hits the catcher's mitt, he's asking for it back. Give me the ball back, and wanting to throw it again. So anyway, it was very impressive watching those two. And then, probably more impressive for me with Davis and Reed and Blake and being able to stay focused and stay in the game and still throwing strikes and getting batters out and competing batter after batter in a blowout game like that. And I think that goes back to what we've been talking about, was that, I was looking forward to what the mental makeup of this team was going to be for the OU game, because I think that truly tells you what this team is capable of. And whether it was the offensive side, the defensive side, the pitching side, whatever it was, the kids stayed locked in for all 9 innings. And that's sometimes tough to do, especially as a pitcher, when you're up 14-5. So,
and even as big as the margin ended up being, there were times where OU got like back within 6. They had 2 or 3 guys on. You're thinking, hey, man, he hit a bomb right here. You never know with college baseball, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's, going into last night's game, OSU, and because we've talked a lot about the strikeouts and some of the negative things and the offensive struggles and things like that. And, going into last night's game, OSU led every offensive category versus their opponents across the board, whether it was runs, whether it's hits, whether it's home runs, whether it's hit by pitches, even down to sacrifice bunts and sacrifice hits. OSU has led every offensive statistical category against their opponents except for one, and that was runners left on base. And last night, I think
that's a blessing and a curse. It means that you're getting a lot of guys on, but then you're not driving them in, probably.
Yeah, and it tells you 2 things. That tells you that your pitching staff has thrown well enough throughout the season to win ball games, and 2, you're just not getting the timely hits. Right? You got runners on base, and you're just not getting those 2-out hits, or you're not getting the timely hit when there's runners on second and third, or whatever the case is. And last night they flipped the script, right? And that from the first inning on. Even though they scored 14 runs, they still left 8 runners on base, but they did that with 14 runs. They got the timely hits. Wulfert, I think, had a 2-out double that scored a run or 2, and Benj also. So last night was just a totally different approach, if you ask me, and a mental approach to the game that they've had versus what maybe they had earlier in the season. And I think this is what you're going to see a more consistent lineup look like with those upperclassmen at the top of your lineup and those underclassmen at the bottom of your lineup. And, we've talked about this a lot just coaching together. I mean, you want your 9-hole or 8-hole to be a good guy. You want somebody to turn over the lineup for the top of your lineup.
Or be able to bunt like Charlie Carter did.
Yeah, you need people on base that your 1 and 2 hole can drive in. Also, your 1 hole doesn't need to be lead off every time. So very, very impressive in what they accomplished last night and the way they approached the game and the way they played the game and totally, in my opinion, flipped the script on kind of what we've been talking about as negatives for the first 16 ball games of the year.
Yeah, and the thing about it is, too, we say it all the time, hey, you string a couple hits together. We talked about it in the last podcast. And everybody starts getting involved. At that point, it gets contagious, right? Well, you start the game off with a base hit by Kroll, and then Benj gets a base hit, and then all of a sudden you start base hitting, and people start getting excited about it. You're playing team baseball. Then all of a sudden, next thing you know, you're hitting home runs, too. It's amazing how that works, isn't it?
Yeah, and we've talked about that also, is that when a pitcher's nibbling around the edge and you start drawing walks or you're hitting the baseball hard, that pitcher all of a sudden can't be so fine, and that ball starts to move towards the middle of the plate, which makes everybody a better hitter. Either that or it moves further away from the plate, and you're getting more runners on base. So, and you combine that with the aggressive approach last night at, fastball down the middle and the first pitcher swinging at it, and even I think the announcers even caught on to that last night of how aggressive OSU was on first pitch fastballs. And so, you combine all those things and you start meshing well in those arenas that we've talked about and start getting runners, get some free base runners with walks, hit by pitches and all that kind of stuff. All of a sudden that pitcher can't be so fine and that ball starts creeping towards the middle of the plate.
You mentioned Bogey, Ryan Bogus, who started the game last night. How difficult is it whenever you score the 7 runs in the first inning and then it's like you got ready in the bullpen, then all of a sudden, man, it's been like 30, 35, 40 minutes. And I know that you have a lot of momentum from a team, but honestly, that's kind of a difficult inning to go out there and throw after you've strung up 7 runs and you have all this chaos going on, right?
Absolutely. It is, because, it don't matter if you're in coach pitch or if you're in Major League Baseball. When you get in a situation like that and you get a big lead, what's the first thing that 75
Throw
people
strikes.
Throw strikes. Okay, yeah, no kidding, right? I mean, it's like I'm a Division I athlete, scholarship player at OSU, and somebody's got to tell me to throw strikes. It puts a little bit of pressure on a guy like that. We're in a situation where you would think a guy could just naturally relax and go out there and and throw fastballs and pump the zone and that kind of stuff. Sometimes it makes it a little bit more difficult in those arenas. Same thing with anybody that pitched after Molsky last night, right? How impressive were they, but unimpressive because they didn't strike out the first 6 guys they faced.
Correct.
And that's a difficult act to follow. And those guys, whether it be Gabe Davis or Dominic Reed or Blake or Krantz, they went out there and threw very well. But that's kind of a tough act to follow when Molsky's out there doing what he was doing and having a big lead. So anyway, it was very impressive from that standpoint of how locked in the guy stayed and continued to compete even in a big blowout win.
I really like the Robert Krantz kid. You mentioned him just a minute ago. We didn't mention him earlier. The Wichita State transfer, this kid moves the ball. He sinks the ball, which is, makes it for a very heavy ball to hit. And then also, man, he just fills the zone up. I really like him. Yeah,
absolutely. And kind of just another Rob Walton guy.
Yes.
You know what I mean? He goes out there and pitches, nothing fancy, nothing. He's not out there. He's not 6'6", 215 pounds, 230 pounds, whatever. But he goes out there and pitches just like, whether it was Ryan Bogutz or Robert Krantz and anybody in between, the way they make the ball move, and stay down in the zone, and whether it's moving up and down or left and right, that's, you talk about pitching, and that's what you always hear when you talk to guys that know stuff about pitching. That is changing eye levels, changing speeds, and changing locations. And they can do that with, a multitude of pitches. They can throw that running fastball, or they can throw that changeup that runs from the middle of the plate to the outside the plate, or whatever the case is. And so very impressive, all those guys. And Robert Krantz had just as difficult a situation as possibly Ryan Bogutz is being out there when, the air's been let out of the stadium, everybody's gone, you're still trying to compete, and he goes out there in the last inning and does well.
He really does. First 4 hitters all had multi-hit games. First 5 out of 6 hitters all had multi-hit games. Everybody scored in the game except for Charlie Carter. It was just simply a clinic of offensive baseball for the Oklahoma State Cowboys. It just kind of felt good, like, hey, this team made a statement that this is a team, we talked about last time, well, they might be able to surprise some people, sneak up on some people. It's almost like they feel that at this point, and they came out to prove a point.
Yeah, and, I think everybody in the lineup had a hit except for Charlie Carter too, and that's not to take anything away from Charlie Carter, because like you said, he had a sacrifice bunt and had some good ABs. So they've put themselves in a position now where they're recognized again, and this is OSU baseball. And these guys, had a little bit of struggles at the beginning of the year, and they've kind of found their groove. That Coach Holliday's kind of found a lineup that he likes, I think.
Yes.
Because like I said, that last game against Mercer was when he moved Carson Benj out of the 2-hole and put him in a 3-hole, and last night was a direct reflection of that same lineup. And so, and if you look at it, and you look at the box score from the last game against Mercer and last night's game, we had 5 strikeouts last night against OU, and we had 5 strikeouts against Mercer in that last game. And kind of the Achilles heel of what OSU baseball has been this year was too many strikeouts. And now he's found a lineup that goes back to what we talked about, in that I think he has found a lineup that more naturally suits the skill level and the skills that the batters possess in that particular portion of the lineup, right? And that, because it was the last podcast we were talking about how good a 2-hole Benj is, and he's an even better 3-hole.
Yeah.
And so, and being able to shuffle Avery Ortiz around in the lineup and Colin Ritchie and get them down
Jackson
there.
Kroll.
Yeah, Jackson Kroll, and maybe get those young guys down the bottom lineup, or maybe they see a little bit more fastballs and that sort of thing. I think this is a pretty good lineup. And then you start having the conversation of, when Schubert does get healthy, where's he go? Who's he going to replace? You're going to put Schubert in for Colin Ritchie? or are you going to stick with Colin Ritchie, or where does he fit in the lineup? Now that's crazy to even talk about when you're talking about Nolan Stewart, who's a freshman All-American last year, of how vastly the landscape changed last night in the win against OU and the production and the mental approach that the guys had to the game. Of now, where is it that you insert Nolan Schubert? And you start talking about, surely this isn't a Wally Pipp story, and anybody that knows anything about baseball knows the Wally Pipp story. He was a guy that played for the Yankees back in the 1920s, and he got sick one day, and the guy that replaced him was Lou Gehrig, and however many games later, what was it? Over 2,000 games later, Lou Gehrig's still sitting there or playing there. So, and I don't think that's the case with Schubert. I'm just speaking to how productive the guys have been the last two ball games, how they limited the strikeouts, how we've, even in that first inning last night, you have a double, you have a home run, and you've got a first and third bunt. And you know how I love the first and third bunt. Oh, yeah,
best play in baseball, baby.
Best play in baseball. And it's hard to defend. And to see the big ball characteristics and the small ball characteristics in the first inning of a ball game, that led to a 14-5 blowout. I think, again, just speaks volumes to what the OSU staff is willing to call on their kids to do in the mental approach that they took last night.
Demand, not just call on, demand. Hey, this is what we're going to do. This is the style of game we're going to play today. And damn it, you're going to go out and do it. We're going to beat OU, right?
That's correct. It's an expectation. It's not an option.
Yes, correct.
We're not here to surprise people. We're here to let everybody know that the first part of the season isn't who we are.
Listen, we got OSU on our jersey. They got OU on our jersey. This is baseball. We win this game. Go out and win.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. And so, anyway, I thought it was great. My son had a baseball game last night, and I didn't even listen to the ball game because I wanted to go home and watch it on demand. And I did. I sat down and watched it, and just was impressed from the first pitch on. And like I said, and I keep bringing it up today, but that was one of the highlights that I was wanting to look for. And I said that at the end of our last podcast was, what is the mental approach going to be, or the mental makeup of this team going to be against the OU game? Because I really feel like that's what you can expect out of this ball club moving forward. Now, that sometimes occurs because you played really well. Now the expectation is a lot higher than it was, 5 days ago. And so, but that's where OSU sits right now, and it's exciting, and hopefully continue that momentum and continue to play well.
You mentioned continuing that momentum. This has been a team that has beaten Arkansas and then had a couple of rough games. It's just kind of been one of those they have not been able to capitalize off of any momentum that they've created for themselves so far this year. You worried about that at all? Where do we go from here?
No, I think for me, it goes back to the experimentation with the lineup. And I think that plays a big part
Good point.
in not being consistent in your momentum swings either. And I really think that on Friday when they roll out against UCF, if it's the same lineup as it was against OU and the same lineup as it was against the last game against Mercer, then I think you can expect OSU to continue that momentum. Now you're talking about a road trip, and that's not always easy, but you're talking about a road trip to Orlando, Florida. You're not talking about a road trip to somewhere north. So should be good weather and should be exciting to watch. And I think they've found that lineup that they think they can be consistent with and have the most production with. And if we see that Friday and this weekend that the lineup stays pretty much the same. Now you may have a time or two where a DH changes or something like that, but your OSU's kind of sitting in a little bit of a different situation where their DHs are leadoff. You can't just go call on anybody to be a leadoff guy. And you may have 3 or 4, 5 guys that you can call on at different times of year to be a DH in the 4, 5, 6 hole, something like that. Somebody that has some power and pop, but somebody that is going to be not necessarily a high batting average guy, but a high on base guy and be able to steal bases. That's hard to find in the DH. So I think you're going to see that.
It's hard to commit to because you always want more extra thump with the DH, right?
Absolutely. And so anyway, that's where I think, to continue the momentum and to speak on what you're asking is that if we see the same lineup on Friday, I think you can see that momentum continue.
Fantastic. Fans, we want to thank you for tuning in to another Oklahoma State podcast. Hey, poor Sooners again. How about them Cowboys last night, right? That was simply fantastic. So thank you so much for tuning in. So until next, it'll be next weekend, next Sunday, next Monday, whenever we release our next podcast, we want to say thank you for tuning in and go Pokes.
Go Pokes.